morning, Anchor Church. My name is Josh. I'm one of the pastors here. So glad that you've gathered together with us this morning. It's a sweet season to celebrate King Jesus, the baby who came to rescue the world. I want to say if you're new here, welcome to the crowd. I am too. This is week 3 for me. But if you're new here and if you have any questions about anything that we do here, whether it's something that is sung or prayed or preached or whatever, if you have any questions, man, it would be our joy to speak with you about that, answer any questions that you might have. So let me know. You can let any of the staff know, really anybody who is up here on the stage at any time. We're an open book for you. So let us know if you need anything or have any questions. Well, my kids love that show. From Netflix, Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events. Have you guys ever seen A Series of Unfortunate Events? A few of you out there. I used to love it myself until I realized that every single episode was the exact same thing. Maybe your experience is the same thing as mine. Over and over again, the Baudelaire kids fall prey to one of Count Olaf's not very clever disguises, and they end up in this series, this long series of unfortunate events. That's why the show is named what it is. It's just like one catastrophe after another with no apparent resolution anywhere in sight. It can be so frustrating to watch the characters in that kind of show, rooting for them, and then they're constantly being prevented from getting where they want to be or where they need to be or the safety that they need to find. Well, the story of Ruth is not too dissimilar from a series of unfortunate events. It's just a series of setback after setback after setback for Naomi and then for Ruth as well. And as we saw last week, and I think we'll see again this week, Ruth's story is our story too. God authors our setbacks to lead us to salvation. He's the author of your setbacks, but it gets you in the end to where you need to go. Here's another way to say it maybe. For Christians, life is a series of setbacks, but eventually the road leads to salvation, or eventually the road leads to redemption. Life is full of setbacks. You know this as well as I do. Life is full of unfortunate events for us. And it definitely was for Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law. But as we'll see, eventually she makes it. Here's a super brief recap of chapters 1 through 3. We covered 1 and 2 last week. I'm going to catch us up on chapter 3, and then we'll dive into 4 this morning together. In chapter 1, the Lord led this small family into a bitter calamity. There was a famine in their land. It was unfortunate event number 1, famine in the land. So Naomi and her husband Elimelech move about 50 miles over to the country of Moab. Sometime after their arrival, Naomi's husband Elimelech dies. Unfortunate event number 2. And her 2 sons marry foreign, pagan, unbelieving wives. Unfortunate events 3 and 4. Years later, Naomi experiences the death of her 2 sons, 5 and 6. We find out in chapter 1 that neither of those sons produced any children. So there's unfortunate event 7 and 8. And so she's left with 2 daughters-in-law. And even one of them leaves her. Unfortunate event number 9. Just a series of bitter losses and setbacks. Sometimes I wonder in our Western wealth if we can really empathize with what Naomi is up against here in this series of unfortunate events. For example, because of life insurance, I am definitely worth more dead than I am alive, all right? I've told this to Miriam, not like too many times, but I have told her that I'm worth more dead than alive. Thankfully, she is not a money grabber. We praise God for that. But because of life insurance, a surviving spouse can have some financial predictability in the wake of that loss, right? In the wake of that grief. But in Ruth and Naomi's day, the idea of life insurance was still a couple thousand years in the future. So Elimelech, Naomi's husband, was definitely worth more alive than he was dead, which made it impossible for Naomi to imagine anything but eking out a meager existence for the rest of her days. She had no hope. She had nothing to look forward to. No retirement like some of us are looking forward to. No nice piece of steak. No weekends away. Naomi is empty, and she's bitter. Chapter 1 ends with Naomi's bitter complaint. She says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. The Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. But then we turn to chapter 2, and Naomi is filled with a little bit like a surge of hope because this guy named Boaz appears on the scene as a potential husband for Ruth. But Boaz wasn't just a husband for Ruth. He was to be a redeemer for Naomi too. But like with any good story, there's like tension in the plot here that gets introduced. Boaz does not propose to Ruth. He doesn't make any moves on her at all. And I am guessing that Naomi just gets sick of waiting for Boaz to do his thing. So she hatches a kind of like shady plan with Ruth. As the story unfolds in chapter 3, Ruth follows her mother-in-law's advice in this shady plan, and she puts on some perfume, she dresses all up nice, and she hides herself in Boaz's threshing house until he falls asleep. And this is where the story kind of gets a little bit weird right here. She uncovers his feet in the middle of the night. And this is like where I would have been out on Ruth right away, right there, right? You're not going to mess with my feet in the middle of the night. But Boaz is a nicer man than me, more gracious. Eventually, he wakes up, and the strangest marriage proposal ever happens in this moment. Ruth proposes marriage to Boaz with his feet uncovered, and she does this by requesting that he fulfill his role as what was called in that day a kinsman redeemer. Kinsman redeemer. Here's like a very brief description of a kinsman redeemer. You can find this for yourself in Leviticus 25, but I tried to summarize for us. When an Israelite husband who had failed to leave behind a son died, the brother of the deceased man was commanded to take his widow as wife and both redeem the land, like keep the land in the family, and provide a son to carry on the deceased father's name. So that's what a kinsman redeemer would do. And the term basically it means like what it sounds, kinsman, a relative, the nearest adult male relative. So in order to be a redeemer to both Naomi and Ruth, Boaz would have needed to be the nearest kin to Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband. That's the kinsman part. And the redeemer part just means that guy had the right to purchase the land, redeem the land that had belonged to Elimelech. So when the idea of this plot dawned on Naomi, let's get Boaz in the family to redeem me and keep Elimelech's field in the family. When this idea occurred to her, hope surged for her. There actually was a way for her fortunes to be reversed if all of the right dominoes fell for her. But right when it seems like all of this tension is going to resolve with Boaz and Ruth riding off into the sunset, this massive plot twist drops. So Boaz, sitting up on the threshing floor with his feet uncovered, he responds to Ruth's proposal like this in chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. He says, "And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So here we are, rooting for this unlikely, unexpected love story like we talked about last week. But this other dude is going to step in and ruin everything. And all the romantics among us in here this morning want to just cry out, no, it's supposed to end happily and beautifully with Boaz and Ruth and Naomi. And now this other punk is going to step in and mess it all up, right? That's what we're feeling. That's what we should feel when we're reading through this story. Another unfortunate event, another setback to what Naomi needs, where she's trying to get. So chapter 3 ends in the suspense of another in our long series of unfortunate events. The curtain closes, and we, like Ruth and Naomi, are left wondering how they are going to manage going on, living a meager life. And this brings us into chapter 4, the last chapter of this unexpected love story. Boaz takes the blanket off, and he goes to the city the next morning, and he takes a seat at the city gate. This was normal behavior. It would have been like where the businessmen of the day gathered to do business, so very normal in that day. And here's what Ruth chapter 4 opens up like. It says, "Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. And so Boaz said, 'Turn aside, friend, sit down here.' And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, 'Sit down here.' And so they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I might know. For there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And the guy responds, he's like, I'll redeem it. We don't even find out this relative's name here. Boaz there in verse 1 is like, hey, friend, come on over here. I mean, Boaz knew his name. He was his close relative, his kinsman. But he's like forever Mr. What's-his-face, all right? He doesn't let us know his name. And Boaz lays out the situation for him. And here's the gist. Before Naomi and Elimelech moved to Moab, they owned some land. And when she returned a decade later, Naomi still owned that land. But she can see the writing on the wall. She's getting older, she's too feeble, she's too frail to be able to cultivate that land and to make it profitable. So she's going to sell the land to make enough profit to live off of. That's what's going on for Naomi. But the first right went to the closest of kin, that kinsman redeemer idea. Boaz was close, but he was not as close as this other guy. So Boaz tells this dude that he can buy it and take the inheritance and that it rightfully belongs to him first before Boaz. And what's his face says, okay, fine, I'll redeem it, I'll take it. And most of us in here, if you're following along the story, really want to say, no, you won't redeem it. That's not going to happen. You just get out of here. You're going to mess the whole thing up, Mr. What's-Your-Face, all right? But he says, yes, I will redeem it for Naomi. And it makes sense. This is like a fiscally wise choice. It's a good business move for this guy. On the surface, it's an amazing deal for him. Who would say no to a deal like this? For very little money, he would carry out a respected family duty and perhaps enhance his civic reputation. Financially, the investment was a bargain without risk. His little investment would develop into years of productive, profitable harvests. It would enlarge the inheritance of his heirs. So how could he lose? That's from a commentary on the book of Ruth. But can you imagine if the story of Ruth ended right here with this guy riding off into the sunset with Ruth? But Boaz plays his ace in the hole next. And I purposely stopped where I did in verse 4 because he's like, oh, shoot, I forgot one more thing. Follow along in verse 5. He's like, the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, I can imagine him doing this right here, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. So you may not realize it on the surface here, but Boaz is like, he's super smooth in this moment. He is making a couple of interesting and very deft moves right here. He intentionally calls Ruth the Moabite to this guy because it would have had shame attached to it. And in a shame-based culture, this would have been something that you would avoid at all costs, associating with someone who would drag the family name down. But Boaz also mentions perpetuating the name of the dead in his inheritance. And the dead he's referring to there in verse 5, he's referring to Ruth's first husband, Mahlon. In other words, Ruth and this guy's firstborn son, so Ruth and the new guy's, Mr. What's-His-Face's firstborn son, would be recognized as the son of Mahlon, not as Mr. What's-His-Face. Why is this? Well, Deuteronomy 25 answers this for us. It says, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. So this is a way of God protecting the assets of, this down and out woman, caring for her. So Mr. What's-His-Face would have understood the implication based on his knowledge of Deuteronomy 25. He and Ruth's child, not him and his kids, so he and Ruth's child would inherit the field and the land and the profits. It's like one commentator says, if there were to be a child born from the relationship with Ruth, the Redeemer would lose the field and there would be no benefit to his own children and estate to compensate for the costs involved in taking care of Naomi and Ruth. In other words, Mr. Whoosy-Wutsy was interested in ministry to the poor only if there was a payoff for himself and for his family. So I hope you're tracking with me in this story here. So after Boaz put all the pieces together for him, the guy says in verse 6, I cannot redeem it myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. That's good news for the story, at least, the unfolding of this unlikely love story. And we as the audience should be very happy to hear it. And we all want to say yes, as we see this drama unfold and this love story culminates. And we are meant to compare these two potential redeemers, Boaz and this other guy. Boaz, redeemed Ruth, even though it was not going to be financially profitable for him. In fact, it cost him. It cost him a lot. But for the joy of having Ruth and saving Naomi, he did it. For the joy of marrying Ruth and saving Naomi, he did it. Is that not a little whisper of Jesus? He redeemed us even though it was not going to be profitable for him. In fact, it cost him everything. But for the joy of having us as his bride. Boaz got Ruth as his bride, and Jesus gets us as his bride at great cost to him. Well, then these two men do this like weird sandal swap thing in verses 7 and 8. And we're left wondering like what in the world is even happening here. Check out verses 7 and 8. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm a transaction. The one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. All kinds of uncovering feet in this story. I just now noticed that in this moment. It's weird. This would have been like the handshake of the day, all right? As strange as it might sound, a handshake deal was just a picture of yielding the right to purchase the land and then marry Ruth. If this was a play, this would have been the part where the audience can't help but like bursting into tears and standing up, a standing ovation, applauding everything. No one in the room not clapping if this is a play. Finally, Ruth and Boaz are getting together. It's done. The world's most unlikely, unexpected love story is now coming to pass. So after all this, Boaz stands up and he shushes the crowd and he makes this impassioned speech. This is verses 9 and 10. He says, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth and the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife. What a journey for Ruth. Can you imagine like what the scenes that are ticking off in the back of her mind during this moment? Think about the turn of events. In 1 verse 20, Ruth the Moabitess. 2 verse 10, Ruth the foreigner. 2 verse 13, Ruth the slave. 3 verse 9, Ruth the servant. She's wanting marriage. And then 4 verse 10, Ruth the redeemed. We've come from Moabitess to foreigner to slave to servant and now redeemed. What a sweet turn of events. For Ruth, life was a series of setbacks, but eventually the road led to redemption. Man, everyone in here, all of us have a checkered past. Your checkered past might be like 20 minutes ago, right? We all bring in our darkness and brokenness into this place. We have a sinful history. We can all look back on our life story, no matter who we are, if it's a short story or a long story, and we can see the sins and the setbacks probably too clearly. But you can know, because of what we learn about God in the story of Ruth, you can know that God is always rerouting you to redemption. Like when Google Maps sends you a different way because of construction or whatever. Maybe it sends you on a route you didn't expect, but the goal is always to get you where you've got to get. God is always authoring your path to get you where you need to go, to get you to the end, still clinging to Jesus. So don't underestimate how heartbreaking and grievous Ruth's life had been to this point. I've never seen that movie, 4 Weddings and a Funeral, but Ruth's life was like the exact opposite of that. Her life story was 3 funerals and a wedding. Her husband, dead. Her brother-in-law, dead. Her father-in-law, dead. 3 funerals. But now she's been redeemed and there's a wedding to plan. 3 funerals and a wedding. And yet we come around to another potential setback here right after the wedding. This unfortunate event is a little bit more subtle, I think, than most of the unfortunate setbacks in this story. Ruth could not, for one reason or another, conceive in marriage for the 10 years that she was married to Mahlon. And this suspense is meant to nag at the back of our minds. And I do want to say that if this is your story right now, if you're wanting a child and you can't, I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I'm sorry. I don't know why God has authored this into your story. He opens and closes wombs. We know that and believe that. And I believe that one day you'll understand why God has rerouted you through this grief. He's authored that into your life. But right now it's just hard and you're just sad. I want you to know this morning I prayed for you, whoever you are. I don't know anyone here like that, but I prayed for you. And I'm hoping God's best for you. And I even prayed that he might, in his providence, grant you children. Last week, I read the lyrics of a really old hymn for us. And maybe they might resonate with you if that's your story this morning and provide a little bit of hope for you. It said this: judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. So this is the soundtrack to Ruth's story. A frowning providence hiding a smiling face. And just as a spoiler, it is the soundtrack to your story too. At the end of it, you will sing and celebrate that song. One other stanza from that old song anticipates the next scene in Ruth. Here's what it says: ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. So this question lingers. If she didn't have any kids with Mahlon, could she now with Boaz? Well, we don't have to wait long to find out. 4 verse 13 says this: so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And the Lord gave her conception. That's an interesting take right there, isn't it, from our author here? See, throughout this story, the Lord has been like a background character. I don't know if you've noticed it or not. Of course, extraordinary grace is kind of inferred all throughout the book in ordinary moments, but only twice. In chapter 1, verse 6, and then chapter 4, verse 13, only twice does God move into the story to act explicitly on behalf of his people. And it's to meet the two major needs of the story. In 1 verse 6, the Lord visits his people to give them food. In 4 verse 13, the Lord visits Ruth to grant her fertility. Food and fertility are the two major needs in Ruth. Without food, they would die. Without fertility, the family line would die off. And we know now, on this side of the cross, like we talked about last week, at this point in history, that our hopes, on this side of the cross, our hopes would be dashed because the Savior's line would have died off if this marriage would not have happened and if a baby would not have been produced out of this marriage. Ruth, the story of Ruth, is Christmas's origin story because Jesus was Ruth's great, however many greats, I didn't count them, Jesus was Ruth's great-great-grandson, all right? So in any case, if I'm the editor here of this story, I cut it off at chapter 4, verse 13. Verse 13 would have been a great way to wrap things up. And maybe you're thinking right now would be a good time to wrap your sermon up, bro. But we're going to keep going. The book of Ruth does not end with Ruth as the main character, as crazy as that is. The book of Ruth does not end with Ruth as the main character. Naomi is the main character left on the stage to carry us to the end of the drama. And I think it's because the author aims to show us what we've been saying, that God authors our setbacks to lead us to redemption. The story begins with Naomi losing in a big way over and over and over again. And now it ends with her gaining in a big way. It began with death and it ends with birth. She starts empty and ends full. She begins hungry and ends satisfied. Her sons die and then a son is born. But whose son is it? Well, Ruth's son, of course, obviously, right? But read carefully. Look at Ruth 4, verse 17. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. Wait, what? Why is it told like this? This is not an oversight by the author. He knew who birthed the son. He did not forget himself here. It's told precisely like this to demonstrate for us that though life is a series of setbacks and unfortunate events, eventually the road leads to salvation for all of those in Christ. This, I think, really interesting description of Obed as Naomi's son, not Ruth's son, is here to crystallize Naomi's complete reversal of fortune. In this moment, it had to have dawned on Naomi that the worst is part of God's plan. The worst is part of God's plan. It was all leading to this moment with that sweet baby boy on her lap. And it was better. The worst was part of the plan, and it was better than she could have possibly ever imagined. She got rerouted. And it was a bitter, bitter reroute. But the final destination was glorious. God authors your roadblocks, and you can trust him. This is one of the hardest truths that we as Christians have to digest. It is hard. That the pain we endure is under God's control. That is tricky. It's complex. But listen, there is nothing in your life, nothing you experience, no pain you endure, no sickness you suffer, no singleness that frustrates you, no death you observe that falls outside of God's control. You have to believe that, and you have to trust him in that. What are you suffering through right now? What's so bad that you can hardly stand it? It took everything in you to even show up this morning, to even open your mouth a little bit to sing. Whatever it is, God is there. He's with you. He helps you make it to the end still walking toward Jesus, probably with a huge limp, but you're gonna make it. And when you draw your final breath on this earth and finally see things from God's perspective, as hard as this may be to believe on your road with all of your current roadblocks, you won't want to change a thing. God, in his infinite wisdom, authors our setbacks to lead us to salvation. The book of Ruth exists to show that God is always at work in your darkest hours, able to overcome the most difficult obstacles and bring you to the worship of the great grandson of Obed, Jesus Christ, your Redeemer and mine. Oh, our providences may be bitter, but sweet will be the flower. I think it was Tim Keller who said, if we knew what God knows, we would ask for exactly what God gives. If we knew what God knows, we would ask for exactly what God gives. One of my kids is particularly oriented to extended melancholy when something doesn't go her way. I am not going to tell you which kid that is, and it's not because I'm afraid of embarrassing her. It's because I've worked out a deal with each of my girls. If I name them in a sermon, they get $1, all right? So it's not financially prudent for me to name Eden, Ellie, Evie, or Nora. Whoops. You get $4 this afternoon, girls, if you're in here. If you're not in here, it doesn't count. In case you're wondering, Miriam has negotiated her rate all the way up to $100, all right? Anyway, after one of my girls has experienced something sad, she hangs her head, tends to be mopey, and she keeps that sad countenance like far longer than is necessary or that is like proportionate to whatever sad thing happened to her. And many, many times I've literally like gotten down on one knee and just like tried to make eye contact with her like that and push her little chin up and get her to look me in the face and say, listen, it's gonna be okay. I got you. I'm your daddy. I love you. I'm for you. I know this sad thing happened, but it won't always be like this. You don't have to stay sad. You don't have to be sad anymore. I think the whole book of Ruth is like that for us. A little word from Jesus who says, I love you. I got you. It's gonna be okay. I author your setbacks to lead you to salvation. Anchor Church, Jesus Christ is the lifter of your head and the lifter of your chin, if you'll just let him be this morning. Today, he's wanting you to feel so desperate, so much so that through prayer, you make eye contact with him and you hear him say, I love you. I got you. I'm authoring all of this to help you make it to the end with Jesus. Some of us need to chin up this morning because Jesus was lifted up in our place. And remember that because of Jesus, it's going to be okay. We are going to make it. In God's providence, the worst is part of the plan. If that's true, then you can always know that the best is yet to come. The best is yet to come. From Ruth's perspective, from Boaz's perspective, from Naomi's perspective, they are simply raising a little boy. Maybe like one of yours just upstairs right now in the kids' wing, right? But in reality, they were raising a little boy who will produce Israel's future king. And now here's the crazy thing to wrap our minds around this morning. Naomi likely never discovered this amazing thing until glory, until heaven. I'd be willing to bet that Naomi thought that when her life was ending, she's taking her final breaths, I bet you she thought that she had graduated from empty to full, from hungry to satisfied, from bitter to sweet. And at some level she had, like materialistically speaking, but it was even better than that. And I'm betting that she passed away before she even knew how truly, deeply her fortunes had been reversed. The best was yet to come for Naomi, and she didn't even realize how good the best was. That is why I said earlier, if you knew all that God knows, you wouldn't change a thing. There's not a single detail that could be altered, even slightly in this story, that would have caused this story to end any more joyfully than it does. And this may be the most important lesson for us to take away from this little book of Ruth. Our stories are intimately tied to his story, and he is weaving all of our stories together into a cosmic tapestry that will tell a far greater story than our individual stories. Because of God's hidden kindness, like we talked about last week, our lives always mean more than we could possibly imagine. That's an important reality to hold to when you are being rerouted through a painful season. When that's happening, you hold to this. The worst is part of the plan, but hang on, because the best is yet to come for all of us as Christians. This little story of Ruth is like a tributary of mercy that feeds into this ocean of redemption. Let me show you what I mean. It's like I read from one author about this part of the story. He says this at this hinge point. He says, unbeknownst to Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, cosmic issues are afoot. I just could not leave that word afoot alone, so I decided to include it for us. There's another foot thing. I did not even mean to do that. Wow. Cosmic issues were totally afoot, and they did not even know it. They did not even realize that the whole universe was turning in these moments. And I believe that cosmic issues were afoot because of who the author says the Redeemer really is in this story, who the author says the Redeemer really is in this story. Now you might think, duh, it's Boaz. He's the kinsman redeemer after all. And you'd be right about that. He says it himself in chapter 3, verse 12. But look at what the text actually says in chapter 4, verse 14. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. And at this point in the story, you might be saying, yeah, go Boaz. You deserve it, bro. You laid your life down. You be renowned in stuff, like Ruth 4:14 says. But keep reading. Look at verse 15. He, and we still assume it's Boaz at this point, he shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Has given birth to the Redeemer. And right now you should be saying, whoa, 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 whoa. The daughter-in-law, Ruth, gave birth to the Redeemer? Well, what? Like, what's happening here? You'd assume it would say, for your daughter-in-law married the Redeemer, married Boaz, the kinsman Redeemer, right? But this changes the whole way we read the whole story of Ruth and really how we understand ultimately that the best is yet to come. The baby is the Redeemer and not Boaz. He's seen as the Redeemer because of his relationship to David, Israel's greatest king. And so here's what Ruth 4:16 and 17 say. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And they include this little detail here at the very end just to connect Obed to David, which was Israel's greatest king. And this revelation here is truly one of the greatest pivot points of history. It's hard to get our minds around it now, but this is a life-altering but ordinary love story. This right here is how we know that there is hope for us beyond the cute baby boy and beyond the happy grandmother. And there is hope for us beyond the grave too. So why is the baby Obed the redeemer instead of Boaz, according to the author here? Well, at one level, he is a life-giving reality to Naomi in her old age. Like when he grows up, he'll be able to take care of his grandma. But there's way a deeper level going on here, a deeper meaning. So let me try to pull these threads together for you real quick, and we'll wrap up today. Obed will be the grandfather of David, Ruth 4. David promises that his son will rule over an eternal kingdom. That's in 2 Samuel 7. And then the name of this son will be renowned in Israel. Now, Obed's renown and fame wouldn't come directly because of him, just because he was super famous, but it's because of his relationship to David. It's like when I walk into my kid's school, right? Maybe you parents have this experience. I'm not Josh there. I'm Eden's dad. I'm Ellie's dad. I'm Evie's dad. I'm Nora's dad. And I guess that's another $1 for each of the four of them, which is actually $8 total today. So, man. This is why I don't use their names, because it's like eventually becomes financially unsustainable. But at their school, my value is only tied to who I am related to. There's no value in and of myself, right? Same for Obed. His worth and value in the story is ultimately tied to who he is related to. And David, as renowned as he was, his fame wouldn't come directly from himself, but as a result of his relationship with his eventual son, Jesus, the baby king and redeemer of the world. Obed is the redeemer in this story because he will redeem by bringing forth the redeemer. You tracking with me? Obed's the redeemer because he will redeem by bringing forth eventually Jesus, the redeemer. And this is good news for us. Our identity and our value isn't tied to us, but to who we know and to whose we are. I'm famous in school because of my kids, and I can lay down my insecurities in this life because of my Christ. He stands in my place as my substitute. When God looks down, he does not see me, he sees who I'm related to. If you're not a Christian, and this all sounds a little bit weird, no worries at all. I can empathize with that. Track me down afterwards. I'd love to be able to speak with you about this. The best news in all the world, that you can be judged by God, not based on your performance, but on the performance of another, your older brother, Jesus. Well, tucked away in this little twist of a script, a baby redeemer, and not Boaz, like we might expect it to be, is a mind-blowing little seed that would grow up into the cosmic tree of redemption that we enjoy and celebrate today and sing about. The true and better redeemer, true and better, more better than Boaz and then Obed, is Jesus. And Jesus was baked into the cake right here in Ruth 4, thousands of years before he even set foot on the earth, even right here in this unexpected, unlikely love story. Obed is the redeemer because he is the true redeemer's ancestor. This story points forward to David. David points forward to Jesus, and Jesus points forward to the resurrection of our mortal bodies. Romans 8, when death will be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. This unlikely love story has a significant impact on your life today, but more importantly, in how your story ends for all of eternity. If you don't know Jesus in a saving way, let's talk. Naomi's story is that the worst is part of the plan, even when you can't see it or understand it, and that the best is yet to come, even when you can't see it, like that veil of thick dust like we talked about last week. All right, so since we are wrapping up our time in Ruth together today, I wanted to review some of what we talked about last week and then suggest some new thoughts too. Just 3 things here. First, we can trust the hidden kindness of God. Naomi's experience echoes what grieving Yale professor Nicholas Wolsterstoff wrote in the aftermath of his son's tragic death in a mountain climbing accident. He says this: through grief, the world has a hole in it now. I shall look at the world through tears. Perhaps I shall see things that dry-eyed I could not see before. I don't know what you faced. I don't know what you're facing or what you will face, but I know it will be hard at some point. It will be unfortunate. It will be sad. It will feel like a setback, but you can know with certainty that God is weaving those threads together for your good. He's authoring your roadblocks to lead you to redemption. If you're a Christian, you never have to wonder why something is happening in your life. The answer is always to make you more like Jesus and to help you make it to the end still clinging to Jesus. And on the other side of your grief, perhaps through tears, like Naomi and Ruth, you will see glories that you never thought that you would see. We can trust the hidden kindness of God. Second, coincidence is actually providence in street clothes. We talked about this last week. Coincidence is actually providence in street clothes. This means that nothing insignificant happens in your story. God is powerfully present even when he is apparently absent. And God's will for your life is being revealed day by day through the unfolding of ordinary events. I think we're tempted to believe that God has left us alone. But Ruth, the story of Ruth, is here to rouse us from our unbelief. God's presence may be veiled, but it is there. You can trust that. And then third and finally, we must never believe the lie that the sin of our past means that there is no hope for our future or that we don't have usefulness in the present. The sin of our past does not impact our usefulness to God right now today. This entire series of unfortunate events in this story seem to be like custom built to get the Moabitess Ruth, and a prostitute's son, Boaz, into the genealogy of Jesus. What in the world are people like that doing in the line that leads us to the Son of God? What could Jesus possibly be thinking? Brothers and sisters, they are in that line for the same reason that we are in the line, for the same reason that we are in the family. Not because they did anything to deserve it. They are only in that line and we are only in the family because of grace that is demonstrated to us at the cross. We find ourselves in God's family for the same reason, because of the person of Jesus who came to save the worst of sinners. We need a kinsman redeemer badly like Ruth, worse than Ruth. And Jesus, God of very God, became our kinsman redeemer. He became like us. He drew near to us like Boaz did to Ruth. And then he lived perfectly in our place to give us the resume we need to get to God. He died violently in our place to pay for our pathetic resumes. But then 3 days later, you know how the story ends, like we sung a few minutes ago. 3 days later, he rose victoriously from that grave to give us all the grace we need to be adopted into that family. They didn't deserve to be in the line of Jesus, and neither do we, but we are in it by God's grace. No sin in your past determines your future. God redeems and uses broken things like me and like you. That is good news for Naomi. That was good news for Ruth. That is good news for me, and it is good news for you too. Will you pray with me? God, thanks for this unlikely love story. We too are living in an unlikely love story. It was not likely that we would end up in your family, but somehow you have rerouted our stories to redemption, and we thank you for that. We thank you for the hardships. We thank you for the wins. We thank you for the losses. And we pray that you would help us stay faithful to the end, Jesus. We need you to keep walking with us. Spirit of God, we need you to keep blowing wind in our sails and holding our hands, or we're not going to make it. So please help us in this. Amen.